framework and how do we replicate our success going to a new market? Because my assumption is here for a lot of you. I mean, you had a business or you have a business, it works, and now you're going to go to some new market somewhere you haven't been. And how do you make sure that's a profitable venture that actually uh, grows your business, makes your business more successful, more profitable, not less successful and less profitable? Um, so, the two main things that you need to make sure you cover to do this correctly. One is to do business in the right place. And I'm going to talk about more specifically what I mean. In fact, that's the main focus of this section of what I want to talk about. Um, because there are things you do well and you need to be able to do them well elsewhere. But each market has its own dynamics in a couple of different respects, and they tend to be key respects that will impact the way your business performs and your ability to do what it is you do well in order to be successful. And so, my experience over many years of working with people on this is when businesses go to a market and they fail, it's not so much that they're doing the wrong thing, they're doing it in the wrong place. They're in a market where they simply cannot recreate the keys to their success. And so, that's what I'm going to spend most of the first part talking about. So I won't belabor it right here. And then the other piece is to do business in the right way with the right people. And so one of my later modules is about sort of what do I mean by that? Who are the right people, and where do I find the right people? So before getting into this, what is the right place for your business? Let's think more generally about what is the place out there in general when we're talking about other markets. And so I'd like to start with this sort of two really different views of what goes on in the international marketplace when you go from your home market and now you're going to be an international player, you're going to be in other markets. The first of these quotes comes from a guy, Dr. Ted Levitt, who was a professor at the Harvard Business School, and actually is credited with popularizing the term globalization, or globalization of markets. And he began looking this. He wrote most of his stuff in probably the 80s a little bit, but looking at his international markets really began to take off and open up because of two things. One was, of course, computing power, that allowed companies to integrate management of supply chains and finance and whatnot. And the other huge change, of course, was intermodal shipping, which drove the cost of export shipping down to a price level that just about anybody could afford to do it. And so it caused this kind of explosion in international trade. And as he looked at companies going and doing this and being successful, his advice was that the global competitor will constantly seek to standardize its offering everywhere. It will never assume the customer is king. So his perspective here is, in essence, he talked about a thing called economies of scope. So economies of scale, of course, is when your business starts to get big enough that you have purchasing power, you're producing enough things that you can drive down the marginal cost of what it is you do, and therefore become more profitable just because of your size. And his idea was that as you go into more and different markets, you can sort of take that economies of scale idea and take it even one step further, because you can create a supply chain that's very responsive to particular areas. And if you can integrate it around the world, you just have so many more choices and options for how to optimize how you do business. But the key to doing that was that you try and make kind of one standard thing, whatever it is you do for every market, because that's how you drive these economies of scale and economies of scope. A very different view from the customer is never king, is the view on the right. This was written as a perspective on kind of what the internet was doing to driving consumer behavior in marketplaces. And Dr. Rainey says, in the new information era, there's no difference between producers and customers. Customers decide what is relevant. So obviously, he's looking at a market where, um, you know, so much information is at a customer's fingertips that they can decide what they want and when they want it. And if you can't get it to them, that's your problem. I'll find somebody who can. And so instead of trying to have one global standard product that I can ship everywhere, I wind up in a place where I actually need to be constantly customizing what I do to every individual's taste and preferences. And obviously, the more markets I go into, the more cultural contexts I do business in, the more customized demands there are for what it is I do. So I've got a few poll questions over the course of the day just to kind of generate some feedback. And this is our first one, which is just simply so there's two, as I say, really different views of global markets. And my question is, which of these two views of the global marketplace strike you as the correct description of the world we face as international business people? Ted Levitt's "The Customer is Never King," or Lee Rainey's "The Customer is Always King"? Okay, well, we got one up so far. Okay, all right. Everybody's pretty confident in this internet age that we're all in the second boat. And that maybe result in this group that you all are smaller to medium-sized businesses. Actually, I would kind of think in. Can I get that off? Or are you and I doing the same thing here, or is that just me trying to get it off? And I'm sorry, is Clint? Are you work in the business with the industrial valves, control valves, and actuators?
No, I think that was Mike. I'm
That
doing
was
both.
Mike. Okay, Mike. Okay, I'm a little surprised with that only because I would think you would want to, as much as possible, make your products pretty uniform.
Yeah, they're highly customized. Yeah, so often it's a very technical engineering discussion with the
Okay.
customer.
Okay, so customized though to the particular customer's application, regardless of where they are, as opposed to customized for different markets, if you will.
That's probably
That
accurate.
makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that makes sense to me then. Because I gotta say, so in general, yeah, I think most of us, certainly small and medium-sized businesses, do face the second scenario. And I'm going to talk more about that in terms of our readiness when we go exporting. As I say, the fact is, I mean, it's not unique to international business, of course. I mean, we see it in the toothpaste aisle and the yogurt aisle at the grocery store. We see it anytime we want to order a beer. It used to be simple. It was Bud at home, Heineken away. Now, ordering a beer requires the beer sommelier to give me the full list and description of everything. Because people, I can get what I want, and it is businesses tend to be much more focused on that. So that is very much a reality most all of us here are going to face. Ted Levitt is not wrong for what it's worth in certain business applications. I mean, there are certain companies that do fall into that world. Somebody like Caterpillar Tractor doesn't want to make unique, giant road moving equipment for different parts of the world. They make a thing, they make it well. Other certain technological applications, think of the iPhone. I mean, Apple doesn't make unique iPhones for different parts of the world. And in fact, one of their selling points, of course, is in other parts of the world is if I want an Apple iPhone, I want it because I want an Apple iPhone. I don't want the other strange alteration of that. A few others that fall into that, like somebody like Coca-Cola. Now, even they have some unique formula differences around sweetness and things, but by and large, try and do the same thing everywhere. Anyway, so there are a few that fall into that category. But I would share most of your view that for the most part, we're in this world of customization. And the more we go international, the more we have to be focused on that as a reality for our business. But here's the thing that happens, and it's part of what drives us crazy when that's one of the things we have to focus on is I'm going to argue that 80% of companies wind up in a foreign market because they reacted to some external event. That's a little bit of my own made up statistic. I can't say it's scientific, but I'm pretty sure it's correct from my own experience and other people I've talked to. And the graphic on the left, by the way, is the people who work for you. Their hair is on fire because every time they turn around, now they have to figure out how do I price this in Thai bahts, or how do I ship something safely to Uruguay, or whatever it is. Um, and you may think, well, that's kind of crazy in a sophisticated world of business with lots of information. People are interested in successful strategies to make good business decisions. How can so many people wind up like in the wrong place by mistake? But of course, if you think of the reality of how our businesses work, it makes, perfect sense. I mean, the number one thing, of course, is we pretty much all have websites out there that describe what we do. We have our contact information. The whole purpose of it is to get it out there where people can see us, find us, and come to us. And that happens. And then you get a call from somebody in, you know, Thailand, and they want to order a container load or half a container load or a shipment of something. And, if you haven't been doing this before, it's something like, wow. I mean, this international sales is easy. Like, I don't have to do anything. And the next thing I know, I'm getting orders. How great is that? Except that then you're going to wind up going down this road of, what do I have to do to customize the packaging? What do I have to do to label it differently? What kind of other customer support and marketing materials do I need? How do you price something in Thai baht? I mean, can you do that? Who's going to answer the call when it turns out the person on the front line speaks Thai and your customer service people don't? Or, it's on the other side of the world and they're having the problem in the middle of the night. Anyway, so all those things start to flow downhill. And then the more you wind up with an order here and an order there, you're everywhere. And other things happen too. I work with people who, they go to China because the CEO of the company goes to a conference in New York, and all of his or her peers have a joint venture in China. And we don't yet. And why don't we? Everybody else does. And the next thing I know, I have my people running around trying to figure out how to put a joint venture together in China. Apart from the fact is, A, maybe I don't want to be in China. And B, maybe a joint venture is not actually the best vehicle to go anywhere. But there we are, because that's what we're doing. I say the order comes in from someplace on our website. I've seen things where there's a contact made at a convention. Obviously, most industry trade shows, there are international components. You meet somebody from somebody else. They come up to you, say, wow, love your product. I'd love to be your distributor in Chile. I think I could really do something with your product there. And you're like, wow, I have hardly done anything. I have a potential distributor. Again, how easy is this? And then the next thing you know, you have a deal going on in Chile, only it turns out it's not where you ought to be. It's not a money maker. You have great distractions with people doing things that are not actually terribly productive in terms of your return or profitability. A rumor about a competitor. I mean, again, I've worked with people where the salespeople come back and say, do you know that our competitor ABC sells like 30% of their stuff in Taiwan? I was like, wow, we don't sell anything there. In fact, we're not selling much anywhere. How do I do that? And the next thing I know, I'm trying to go to Taiwan. Well, maybe they went to Taiwan because somebody offhand made an order out of nowhere, and they're there by mistake. And what other kind of strategic thinking is my strategy to do what my competitors do instead of trying to differentiate myself from my competitors in order to build a better business? So anyway, it's a crazy place to be, but it's where we wind up all too much of the time. And the number of you who are in other markets, I'm not sure you said this expressly, though somebody did mention that, you wound up in all kinds of places, and part of it is reactive. And then the question is for you all who are already in however many markets and you got there reactively, one of the challenges I think is to do a step back from there to say, how many of these markets am I actually making money in, or making sufficient money that I'm actually increasing my return on investment, not actually decreasing it. In other words, is my international business strategy making my business more investable or less investable? And if certain places, certain markets are making your business less investable, then maybe you ought to think about consciously saying no to some markets and focusing on the ones that make you more investable. Because I'm willing to bet that for most businesses spread out, lots of markets where there's unique things happening. Obviously, there's a lot of drainage and misapplication of resources, human resources, capital resources that happen that ultimately make your business less successful, not more successful. So, what do we need to think about? Again, the point of this is that in terms of doing business in the right place, is if I have a business and I understand, I get it, we do well. We're making good money. That's why I want to grow into new markets. The key is when I go to a new market, I need to be able to replicate the things that allow me to be successful here. And so I break that down into understanding four dimensions of what we do. So in a sense, before I worry about going international, or as I'm worrying about that, I think the key strategic thing we need to get focused on is what are the things that allow us to be successful here or in our current market, the market we're already in. And so, as I say, I look at that kind of four characteristics. One is, what is it that our customers actually buy? So what's our value proposition? What is it we do that actually creates value that people want to pay for? And I'm going to dive into that more in a second and tell you why that's A, so critical, and B, why it gets screwed up so often, even by sophisticated companies going into new markets. The second is, what's our core competency? How do we actually deliver the value to our customers? Because that changes when we go to new markets, or can change. And we need to understand what it is we need to really do well. And when I talk about core competency, I mean, every business has lots of things you need to do well. There's usually one or two things that you really need to nail. And if you don't get that right, you're not going to be you. The value you purport to create for your customers is not going to actually arrive at and be experienced by your customers. And you're not going to be able to generate the profits and returns you're trying to. A third characteristic is, how do we actually make money? So, I mean, this is beyond, a lot of times we get in international markets, and what we're thinking about is growing sales. We're thinking about growing revenue. But being in business is not about selling more stuff. It's about making more money. As I've said more specifically, it's about generating a return on investment that makes our business investable compared to the alternatives. So I'm going to talk about a perspective on that again to think about strategic. And then lastly, what's our competitive advantage? Again, here, presumably we're successful because we know the market. We understand how to play the market around who are our competitors, what are the pricing dynamics, what does government regulation do to the competitive environment, all those kind of things. And inherently, when we go to a new market, that's going to change. And so we need to understand, A, what is the new competitive environment? And then B, how do we master that in the same way we've done it here, so that we don't get in there and then we find out we've lost our shirt because the competitive dynamics are such that we're just like another player that's not positioned to take advantage of our strength. So those are my four things. So what I'm going to do is kind of dive into each one of those separately about what I mean by that and what are the dynamics internationally. Okay. So far, so good. Okay. So what I mean, a value proposition, yes, one of those business buzzwords people use, but what I mean by it's the thing that your customers really buy. And when I say that, what I mean is it's actually the story that you tell your customers. It's not the thing. The thing is fine, but the thing generally is a commodity. In more cases than not. And whether you're Starbucks selling coffee or whatever, Nike selling sneakers. I mean, the thing itself is a thing. But that's not what adds value to it. The thing that really makes it valuable to customers, that allows you to really be profitable, has to do with the story you tell about the values that are inherent in your business, in your product, in your way of treating customers, in your way of doing business. And then your customers are the people who tell themselves that same story, who see the world in the same way, so that when you present your value proposition to someone, there's actually an emotional resonance. I mean, people are like, wow, yeah, these are my people. I want to do business with them. And that is your competitive advantage because, our goal as business people, sometimes we say, well, our goal is to be competitive. That's a lot of nonsense. Our goal is to be anti competitive. I mean, our goal as business people is to establish a strong enough value proposition in terms of what we do that we've created our own little market space where we're mini monopolists. I mean, that's where we want to be in the perfect world. And that comes down to what's the story we tell that makes us different from all the other people in our same general market space. And that becomes hugely important when we go to foreign markets just because of what happens to price competition. And it's really the only way to protect ourselves, even more than in our home. So here's the proposition I want to make to you, whether this is intuitive or not. Some of you may already believe this, some of you may not, some may not have even heard of this thought, but here's the pitch I'm going to make to you, as I say. The thing that we do that provides value to customers is not the thing we sell, it's the story we tell. And I don't care whether it's soup or it's toothpaste, or we the people who buy Crest or Colgate in the grocery store, or we the people who buy the crazy baking powder formula from the farmer in Vermont. Are we the people who go to Starbucks, or are we the anti-Starbucks people who go to the coffee shop in the back of the funky record store? Or maybe we're not even coffee people. We go to the Kombucha bar or whatever it is. It's true of the people who buy their enterprise software from SAP or Oracle, or the people who are going to work with the, funky skunk works in the loft down in Lodo because of the way these people can understand our business and who we are and customize solutions for what we want to do. It's true of the cars we buy. And to make the point, I'm actually going to delve into the story of a Prius versus an SUV as products and what their value proposition is. So I could make the argument to you that a Prius and that big Chevy, whichever one that was, Suburban, are really just two different versions of essentially the same product. I mean, they're both modes of personal transportation. They both operate with two axles, four wheels, rubber tires, predominantly an internal combustion engine. They both need complementary infrastructure in order to function. They need gas stations. They need roadways. They need traffic rules that we all have a common understanding of. They both go to market in essentially the same way. They go to market through a network of independent dealers regulated principally at the state level under state automobile dealerships. I mean, yeah, same thing. Other than, yes, there are little technical difference, right, on specs, right? One has bigger cargo space. One gets a little better gas mileage. And so we tell ourselves these rationalizations about why we buy stuff around the specifications inherent in the product. But I mean, would anybody here want to argue with me that actually the Prius and the Chevy Suburban are just two versions of the same product? I mean, from a customer's point of view, from the people who buy them? I mean, I'd have to tell you, in my experience, the person who drives the Prius can't even have a civil conversation with the person driving the giant SUV about personal transportation choices. And why is that? Well, it's because the person who buys the Prius, yes, they'll talk about better gas mileage and I can, park in my garage using so much, blah, 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 blah. The reality is they are someone who places importance in their own worldview on, saving the planet and environmentalism. And they realize, no one of us can save the planet by ourselves. But if we each do our little part, we can start to make a positive difference. And so when I pull up to the grocery store and get out of my Prius, I feel good about myself because it's a reflection of who I am. The story it tells is the same story I tell about myself. And that's why, at the end of the day, I'm attracted to that car instead of the other. Conversely, and this is not a value judgment about, different people's stories, just different people tell different stories, and products tell different stories, and who therefore they connect with. But the person driving the giant SUV, they don't need to save the planet. They own the planet. I mean, they can go anywhere with this bad boy and carry anything with them they want, and as many people as they need to. So, good for you. The planet's doing just fine, and I'm doing even better, by the way, as evidenced by my big bad SUV, right? So anyway, I mean, the point is, it's two different people who see themselves differently, tell themselves differently, and that's kind of what they're getting at. I can make this argument, as I say, about sneakers and toothpaste and coffee companies and all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, the thing that they're selling is not just the thing. It's more than that. And so here's the thing about this. Stories are cultural. And so just because you have a story that works in one market doesn't mean it's going to work in another market. Because you don't just need people who buy the thing. You need to find people who have a worldview that resonates with the branding and the story. I mean, this is what branding is, right? It's storytelling. The story you tell so that they actually are your target customers. Because your customers aren't just anybody with a credit card or anybody with a company, requisition account. Your customers are the people who want to use your stuff instead of your competitor's stuff. Because there's something about what you do, how you pitch yourself, how you brand yourself, how you tell your story that makes you attractive to me. And you're not going to be attractive to everybody. I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience trying to sell your product to people, and you can talk to them all day long, but they're wed to somebody else. I mean, you're just not going to change their mind. And yet there are other people you talk to, and it suddenly like resonates like we've been best friends forever. Because there's actually this emotional resonance that created with storytelling and branding. So anyway, that's what needs to happen. So I want to give you a couple other examples of this in international marketplaces around products that have done this well, or companies that have done this well, and companies that have not done this well. And before I'm going to tell two stories from here, but before I do that, I got another poll question. So the question is, which is the product on the far right side of the slide there? Is it Suzhou Joywell Choco Coconut Straws? Is it Dingwan Food Company's special holiday cookie? Or is it Mondelez Nabisco Oreos? Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in real quick, or undecided? They certainly look like coconut straws. And they look like they'd be a great special holiday. Okay, so you can't fool everybody, but you can fool some people. Those actually are the Chinese version of now Mondelez, formerly Nabisco's Oreo cookie. There's something about the vibe of the box and the branding that tells you that, even though the cookie itself doesn't look anything like an Oreo. But I'm going to tell you that story second. That's a story of a company that did something right. Before I get there, I want to go to the left and talk about that thing on the left there, which obviously you can see it's Campbell's, presumably Campbell's soup. Unless you read Cyrillic, you might not know what else it is. But here's the story of the soup. This is Campbell's soup going into Russia. So Campbell's soup, obviously, they're probably the largest single soup manufacturer in the world. And a number of years ago, they made a very intentional effort to expand internationally. And to their credit, they did quite a bit of market research to figure out where they ought to go. And one of the principal pieces of data they looked at was per capita consumption of soup. And it turns out that the two markets in the world where people consume more soup per capita than anywhere in the world are easily China and Russia. And so they said, well, that's a no-brainer. I mean, these people are soup crazy. They eat so much soup. So let's go there. So they go to Russia, and they spent 5 years there knocking their head against the wall. And after 5 years, they pulled the plug altogether. They just shut it down. Everything they did. They wrote off, I forget the exact number, but I think it was like $280 million they wrote off on their investment in trying to go to Russia. Now, Campbell's Soup can write off $280 million and say, yeah, we tried, it didn't work. Most of us on this call don't have $280 million to write off and say, well, gee, that didn't work quite the way we hoped. So you got to kind of understand how to get this right in the first place. So the question is, what did Campbell Soup miss? I mean, it's a very sophisticated company. And here they go, and they spent 5 years trying to build a market in the country that consumes more soup than anywhere in the world except China. And it's a total failure. How is that possible? I'll toss it. Anybody want to raise a hand, give a shot? What it is that Campbell Soup did wrong here?
The presentation of the product don't make sense to that community in Russia, I think.
In what way?
And just if you see the package, the product don't have for me don't have the really impact of to buy kind of product. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, well, what they did with the product essentially is they took their same Campbell Soup branding and simply translated it to Cyrillic. If you look at it, right? Yeah. Anyway, you're sort of approaching the right thing. Here's the thing: Campbell's Soup doesn't sell soup. Starbucks doesn't sell coffee, right? All these people. Campbell's Soup sells convenience. Campbell's Soup sells the ability for the crazy couple where both people work to come home from work and get something on the stove and create a meal in 5 to 10 minutes that is reasonably decent, that makes the kitchen smell like it used to smell like maybe when somebody actually made real soup. And it's convenient, it's easy, it's pretty good. A little too salty for my taste, but not bad. And obviously has a great appeal. But that's the thing. And here's the thing: in Russia, soup is something entirely different. Soup is about the time it takes to go to the market that day and see what ingredients might be fresh enough to make some soup out. More importantly, soup is the time it takes in the kitchen with 3 generations making the soup and passing on family stories and whatnot. And some of this has to do with the simple fact that, and I'll talk about this more in another segment, that Russia is a country, like many countries in the world, where there's more time than money. And so taking that time is important. But the point is, it's important culturally, as important it was. And here's an interesting thing. Campbell Soup actually went so far as to do an amazing thing that, again, most of us could never afford to do. It's a great thing to do if you can, is they hired cultural anthropologists to go into the countries they were looking at and interview people about soup. And the thing is, and they literally came back with reports. A great article I read about this senior VP who was in charge of this. And he gets a report back, and one of the responses is how people they describe soup like their grandchildren. And he's like, these people are so soup crazy, they think of us like family already. How can you go wrong? But it's kind of a classic case of confirmation bias in the sense that that's not at all what they were saying, right? The reason they were describing it that way is because it's about the time spent with family making it in the first place. And throwing something in a pot of boiling water out of a box or a can just ain't doing it. So anyway, the point is, they came in thinking, well, we own soup, we sell soup, you're soup crazy people, how can you go wrong? Without understanding that that's not what they sell that's valuable. And if they had thought about what we really sell and then what's the Russian market for that, and it's not to say there's nobody in Russia who thought, they sold some soup. It wasn't that they didn't sell any soup. They just didn't sell enough to make their investment worthwhile. They were actually making their total business less profitable and lowering their investable return, and so they pulled the plug. And again, they could afford to do that. You can't. So it helps to get this right in the first place. Oops. Did what I never want to do, which is I open the slideshow directly, then I can't get out. So bear with me a second while I find it and reopen. Okay. So now let me tell you a different story. I'm going to tell you the story about Oreo cookies in China, because this is sort of the opposite approach. And again, it's an approach that obviously a large company had the luxury to do. We might not want to. So Oreo cookie was the largest selling snack cookie in the United States. Obviously, a very successful product. The Chinese market was opening up huge, was very amenable to American products, partly simply because of their cultural appeal. And here I got I mean, this is the biggest selling thing in my market. How can I go wrong with this? So Nabisco originally tried to introduce the Oreo cookie as the Oreo cookie, and it was a bust. But they saw pretty quickly it was going to be a bust. And so to the credit, the person who was in charge of this, their vice president of operations in Asia, she stepped back from it and she said to her team, look, I mean, here's the thing. We don't really sell 2 round chocolate discs with white cream in them. I mean, yeah, that's the product, but I mean, there's no magic to that. Anybody can make them. Other people do make them. What is it we really sell, And the thing that someone like Oreo cookies sells is, 5 minutes of guilty pleasure. I mean, they sell the ability to have just, a little bit of dessert. I mean, an Oreo dunked in a glass of milk, my God, it's heaven on earth. But it's this ability, I can have a couple, I can have a few calories. I don't have to eat a giant piece of chocolate cake. I can have something that, hits my taste buds the right way, that finishes off my meal or gives me a little nice snack when I'm just looking for something. I just want to do whatever. Anyway, I mean, that's what that's what anything like that sells. But it's certainly what Oreo cookie sells, and sells really well. So they stepped back and said, okay, if that's what we sell, what does that look like in China? Because it doesn't look like the same thing it does in the United States. And so the result is they completely redesigned, as you can see in that picture, the entire product. They made it less sweet. They put on the chocolate coating, so it's entirely coated in chocolate. You handle it different, you look at it different. I mean, it feels different in the hand. Of course, one thing, one of the magics about Oreo cookies in the United States is we're a milk-based snack culture, right? And so dunking an Oreo cookie in milk is great, and then you play the whole game of how long can I dunk it before it falls apart, breaks, and sinks to the bottom of the glass. There's that magic moment where it's just perfectly saturated in the right amount of milk. Well, in China, culturally and historically, and for other reasons, cold beverages are not a big deal. Cold milk is therefore not a big deal. And so that whole thing was less of a thing. And so, coating it in chocolate, I don't have to worry about we're all going to be dunking it in milk. I mean, people aren't dunking it in milk. It's a different experience. Anyway, so the point is they redesigned the whole thing. And interestingly, today, my understanding is that Oreo cookie in that picture is the #1 selling snack cookie in China. But again, it's because Nabisco or now Mondelez had this vision to be able to step back from that and say, what do we really sell? What's our real value proposition? And let's make something that works in this new market, rather than just trying to push the value proposition we have here, only to find out it doesn't really translate, because people have different wants, needs, likes, cultural attenuation towards the thing it is we do. Our story doesn't. Anyway, so that's value proposition. I want to move on for a minute to the core competency thing, but let me ask real quick before I do that. Any other thoughts, response on the value proposition thing? They're going to tell me I'm crazy. Corey's going to tell me I've been talking for an hour.
I was going to suggest a 10-minute break.
And I'm going to, if you don't mind, let me do one more little piece and then. Okay.
Just a quick question, Craig.
Yeah, Mike.
Curious on your thoughts. So you talked about storytelling and kind of to your point, the value prop. So what are your thoughts on like luxury goods? They seem to be like masters at this, in that they're great storytellers. They'll build up their history. Um, just curious on your thoughts behind that, and on why they've been successful for some of these. If you think Western Europe, some of these companies have been around for hundreds of years, right? And they do a small niche product. They charge a premium for it.
Right. Well, so I mean, I think one of the reasons luxury goods are kind of classic examples where you can really see it. I mean, even if you're a little suspect about this whole idea, is because, of course, um, there are things that we buy just because we need them. I mean, they're not great. We don't love them, but I got a problem, and that's my solution, right? And so the more we are in a needs-based part of the market where I'm not buying this thing because I love it, I'm buying it because I need it. Well, then that's, I mean, I don't have the luxury in a way to, worry about what the story is or how emotionally resonant it is. I just need the damn thing. The more obviously you move into a part of a market where I have the disposable income, I do have the ability to think about, it's about when you're at that point in a marketplace where you can sort of worry about self-actualization as opposed to just meeting needs. And so obviously luxury goods exist entirely in that part of the marketplace. So luxury goods in a way are really only about storytelling. I mean, there's like no need they meet. I mean, a true luxury good, I don't need it, period. I mean, in no way, shape, or form as a human being trying to live on this earth do I need this thing, right?
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of other products in the middle where, there is a need. I mean, some piece of it is I got a problem. This looks like a reasonable solution. I need that. And then the question is, yeah, okay, but why do I need yours more than somebody else's, right? And that's where branding becomes really important. And so, I'll say one other thing about it. So in terms of thinking about like what even is a luxury good, right? Nike's story is a great story because, if you think, I mean, here's a company and they make sneakers, and that's the thing. A lot of other people make, and I mean, a lot of other companies make really great sneakers, right? And Nike sells sneakers for $200 and some dollars a pair, or sometimes even three. I mean, that's insane, right? And look at how Nike advertises its sneakers, right? And by the way, I'm stealing this riff a little bit from Steve Jobs, so I got to give him credit. I'm talking about Nike and what they do, but you know, Nike's ads don't talk about the latest science behind the cellular foam in their soles that provide a little extra cushion, which might give you another extra, tenth of a mile an hour lift when you're running track or anything like that. There's nothing in it about specs or fit or feel. Nike's entire advertising campaign is great athletes doing great things. And then they tell you to just do it, right? It's entirely about emotional resonance at a level of inspiring me to be something I might aspire to be, right? And it enables them to sell a sneaker that is not a luxury good, really, but at luxury good prices, because they've managed to build up the story and obviously associating themselves, with Michael Jordan and other people who help reinforce that story to create a brand that people buy. I mean, people buy the story. I mean, their shoes aren't any better than Adidas or Asics or Brooks or any of the other, right? Anyway, so yeah, so I mean, it's a good question, but I think the reason when you look at a luxury good and say, wow, okay, there I see it. I mean, that's storytelling. It's because obviously at that level of the market, that's like all it is. Whereas most of us operate at a level where there's some needs thing, we're trying to fix a thing. And our challenge actually is to come up with what is our story, what's our brand that makes us different, that creates this anti-competitive space where we get to own our space and therefore also know who our customers are and find our customers and to market effectively and directly because we can identify our customers because they're the people who tell themselves the same story we tell. And then particularly when I'm going to other markets, the key becomes, how do I find my customers there? And it's not like it's not just anybody who buys sneakers. It's not just anybody who buys soup. It's who tells themselves the story that's in my brand, and does that translate? Right? And then some, company with a lot of money can rebrand itself. They can fix the whole thing. They can change the thing, right? Most of us don't have that luxury. I mean, we are who we are, and this is the product we got, and we're going to sell it. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. So with others, I want to talk about the next thing. It's a little quicker, maybe, and then we'll take our first break of the afternoon. So the next thing I want to talk about is core competency. And some of these are examples. Also, I could talk about this storytelling thing too. But, it's said in business, there are really like only 4 kinds of businesses, right? You're either in manufacturing, you're in sales, marketing, distribution, you're customer service, you're in capital allocation. Most of us don't have enough money to be in capital allocation, so we're in one of the other 3. And for most of us, in some way or another, we're in this middle thing. A couple people here on the call might be manufacturing. Obviously, some people do a little bit of all of it. And the question is kind of, well, as I say, what is the thing I really need to nail to be valuable? Like even Mike, again, talking about the customization of your product for people. I mean, you're manufacturing a thing, but it sounds like the thing that makes you different and allows you to do your thing in a way is customer service, because you're able to be responsive to really specific needs and work with customers to solve their specific problem. So that's partly a manufacturing engineering challenge, but it's really making that sale frequently is about great customer service and being there for them when they have an issue, when they need a question answered, when they need a modification done. Anyway, so 2 stories about this. I mean, I put up Walmart and Starbucks because those, in each of these cases, these are companies that are sort of the exemplars of these core competencies. And so I just want to highlight kind of, what can go wrong and what can change if this is your business. So this obviously is a universal price code. This is the thing that drives Walmart's success, because the thing that allowed Sam Walt to turn Walmart from a 5 and dime store in Bentonville, Arkansas, into one of the largest companies in the world was understanding that that thing, when it came in, was not about saving labor. It wasn't about being able to cut out some cashiers because now people can check themselves out with a barcode scanner. It was about the fact that once every product in the store has those things and runs out that way, I own every piece of customer data you could possibly own about your retail product. And so when people like Procter & Gamble or some other suppliers in my supply chain come to me and want to charge me a premium because they think they have market intelligence I need, no, I don't need it. I know more about my customer than you could ever tell me. What I need from you is to get me this much product when and how I want it. And if I tell you I need 2 pallets delivered on Thursday afternoon by 4 o'clock, because I know that that's when this thing's going to sell, and this is the shelf space I'm going to put it on because I know that's where people grab it from, that's what you're going to give me. And I'm going to pay you for your stuff. I got all that. I just need the product. And that's how Walmart drives cost out of its products and how it becomes, its value proposition, everyday low prices. Because they're able to drive costs out of the supply chain because of their superior knowledge about their supply chain, about their customers, about their demands, down to the minute that people buy stuff. So if that's your core competency, is that kind of mastery of your supply chain, what happens to you when you go to a new market? I mean, what's the thing you need to know you have in place in your new market in order to be successful? I mean, that same thing, right? And so a couple things happen to me in a new market. One is I don't know anything about my customers. I haven't been there before. So this core thing I need to be successful is the biggest single thing I'm missing, which is one reason why when Walmart goes into new markets, they don't expand organically. They pretty much always expand into new markets through an acquisition of an existing retail operation. Because what they need to do is they need to buy that customer intelligence and customer data. And then, of course, the other piece is they use that data to drive their just-in-time inventory control and supply chain to take costs out. As I say, I'm going to tell you how much I want, when it's going to get there, and therefore I'm not going to have a bunch of working capital tied up in inventory laying around. And so again, another thing that happens to me in another market is, do they have the logistics capability to deliver things that way? I'll tell you, I've been in markets where, the roads are washed out, the railroads don't run on time, the truck drivers aren't available, whatever it is, and that stuff doesn't happen. I ran a business in Mexico, and the guys who worked for me, their expression was, we don't do just in time, we do just in case, which is fine. And it was a strategy that worked there. It's a strategy we had to use. But if your strategy is, just in time supply chain management in order to be the low cost producer, that ain't going to work. So again, you need to understand, what is that I need to do? Can I replicate that in a new market? And that's hard to do. Starbucks is another one, interesting case. I mean, just so in terms of what Starbucks does successfully, they're selling a product, coffee, that you can make at home for 7 cents. You can make the really good stuff for less than 50 cents. You go out to another drive-through window or up to a counter, get it for 90 cents. You can sit down at a place with linen tablecloths and get it for $1.40. And you're going to walk up to the counter at Starbucks and pay them $2 for the same damn product. I mean, that's insane. And why is that possible? Well, 2 reasons. One is, and Kelvin knows this because I talked about it in our class the other night, but Starbucks, Howard Schultz, who was the CEO and guy who grew Starbucks into what it is, would be the first to tell you, Starbucks doesn't sell coffee. Starbucks sells a customer experience they call the third place, that they very intentionally create. They happen to build it around coffee, but you could have built this around other things. They built it around coffee. But that's the thing that Starbucks sells. And so then so that's the value proposition. But the key is, how do you deliver that? In terms of what Starbucks' core competency is. And the reason Starbucks can do this is because its business model and its people and its training. Starbucks has the best customer training manual in industry, bar none. In terms of how they teach people, everything about who is the customer, what's the customer want, how do you respond to every possible thing you can anticipate that a customer's going to want, how do you treat each other, how do you create a culture in the workplace that creates an environment that allows people to be so nice to customers, to whatever you want. It doesn't matter if it's on the menu board. I want 1 pump of this. I want room for that. I want it at 108 degrees. I don't, fine. You pick it up at the end of the bar. It's not exactly perfect. Maybe you're just not feeling it. I made it the way you want it. It's not fine. I'll pour it out. I'll make it again. It's all good. Because they're creating this customer experience. So if your business is about customer service, it's about creating an experience where I am so responsive and understand my customer needs that, their problem is my problem before they even know they have a problem. And now I'm going to go do this in a new market. I mean, think of the problems that can create around logistics. I mean, one is simply time logistics, right? I mean, usually good customer service experiences are dependent on people. That's what makes a good customer service experience. That's about people. So one is, obviously, I'm here, and the people who create this are people here. Well, now what do I do in another market? I mean, some people, small companies, start by flying their tech people from here to there. And suddenly my customer in India has a problem. Guy in Longmont, Colorado is going to get on a plane and he's going to go to India. Well, that's great, except obviously that creates time lag differences. It's hard to provide immediate response that far away. And then the person gets there and they're jet lagged and they're in another time zone and they're staying in a strange place. And how responsive are they? The other option, of course, is to get people there. And then you have management and supervision issues, obviously cost issues. I mean, you have cost issues flying people around the world all of a sudden, cost issues with new employees someplace. And you have cultural issues around just, employment. Can I hire enough people and train them in that cultural context to create the experience I'm trying to create? And then you have also the cultural question of what constitutes a good customer service experience in a different cultural context. There are all kinds of interesting stories about like one problem Walmart has, for example, not that they have great customer service, but they're famous for their greeter who welcomes people to the store and try and do these things. And they try doing that in some countries, and people are like, ugh, like, no, the last thing I don't want you in my space. Thank you. You know, that's so anyway, you understand what's a good customer service experience? How do I create that? If I create that through people, how do I find and manage the people? Can I do that? Because if I cannot create that experience, I'm not going to be able to replicate the success I have here. Now, there are plenty of markets where you probably can do that, but back to where I started this whole thing, which is the number one thing you need to do, is to make sure you're going to go to markets where you can, in fact, replicate the conditions of your business success. I need to understand what is that, and can I replicate it? I hire people to create that customer service experience, and I get the data I need and manage my supply chain in a different logistics. Manufacturing businesses, on the extent manufacturing is based around, usually a manufacturing business's big thing is making a really high quality, dependable product that always does. It's a Six Sigma business. A true manufacturing business are going to be your Six Sigma, right? It's going to do the thing it's supposed to do 99.9% of the time. Well, again, one of the things that happens is shipping and spare parts and maintenance and all kinds of things happen in other contexts that create problems for those kind of businesses. So again, even in those businesses, I need to know, can I replicate my core competency? I think if you create something that creates value and delivers value to people, you will make money doing it. And so the purpose of business is to create value and deliver value to your customers. And then you'll make money. But there are people who create businesses entirely the other way around. They go out and say, I want to make money. What can I do that would make money? And people do that. You can do it. Personally, I think it creates less vibrant businesses, mostly. Because I think the ones that are really successful are built because the person who builds it really fundamentally, authentically believes in the story they're telling and creating. Because if it's not authentic and it's not delivered consistently, over time, people smell that out pretty quickly. And they recognize that you're just one more person selling the same old crap everybody else is selling. And, you're really not telling my story. And I don't have that emotional resonance. And so I'm not going to be a loyal, happy customer who wants to tell my friends and other people about this. Because it's up. Yeah, it's okay, but it's not.
Yeah, got it little bit, but still, how do we know that because I believe in something and I started doing it and I started getting items from, for example, I know that I know the sandals in India are very we have more varieties. So I thought of like bringing those items and I believed in it and I was using it for several years. But how do I know the people here are interested in? And
When
so,
it's a product people haven't had before, you mean?
Hmm?
Yeah. Okay. I'll tell you what. Hold that question. I get that. That's a good. I'm going to talk in a little different context in the next module about that question. Is how do you find that either your customers are there for some product when it hasn't been there before? So there's no way to directly measure it. Yeah. I do have some thoughts on that. But if you don't mind, let me wait till I get to that in another context.
sure,
Okay.
sure.
Okay. Great. All right. Thanks. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about, my third area, was how we make money. And actually, I'm going to reduce it to this. As I said, our goal the first thing, of course, is, as I said, our goal is not actually to sell more stuff, but particularly in getting into new markets and exporting, that seems to be a big driver of many companies that do it. Is it sales says we're selling more stuff? Yeah, you're selling more stuff, but you're making business less valuable, which seems to be a bad idea. And so then it's like, well, we're not really trying to sell stuff, we're trying to make money. But it's actually more specific than that. We're trying to create a return on our investment or on the assets we have that makes our business more investable, not less. And so I want to have this discussion on a strategic basis just by looking at this simple formula, which is that your return on assets is a function of two things. One is your margin, and the other is your velocity. And so margin obviously is the percent of money you make on each dollar of sales, right? That's your profit. And velocity is the number of times you can take that same asset base and turn it over into sales. How quickly you do that. And so just to prove to you that this idea that return actually equals margin times velocity, I just did a simple algebraic cancel out thing. Margin is income divided by sales. Velocity is your sales divided by your assets. You cancel out the numerators and denominators, and it turns out that return on assets equals income divided by assets, which in fact is what return on assets is, which is just to say that this idea that it equals margin times velocity is true. But here's the reason why I think this is an important equation or dynamic to understand in terms of your financials when you go into a new market. So again, what you're trying to do is increase your return. And you can do that one of two ways, and different businesses do it differently. There are plenty of businesses that are relatively low margin businesses, but they have high velocity. They turn their sales over quickly, and that's how they generate an investable return. Conversely, there are other businesses that have relatively low velocity. I mean, the time it takes in a sales cycle to create and turn over a sale and generate even one sale on that asset base is such that it takes a long time, but they make a high margin on the sales. And the net result of the high margin, low velocity still generates an investable return. But you need one or the other of those two things to be happening. And the problem is that when you go to a new market, when you start exporting, both of them present certain challenges to you in terms of your ability to keep your returns up and not diminish your returns when you do this, right? So first, if you look at margin, I mean, obviously one thing that happens is you have a whole nother set of costs that you didn't have before. You may be customizing a product for new markets in a way you didn't have to do before. You may, obviously, shipping and logistics is going to change. If you have to build your shipping and your costs, it obviously costs more to ship something from here to, Singapore than it does from here to Indiana. So you have new costs going up. And then you're also, and I'll talk about this again more in a second, but your price dynamics are going to change in a new market. And certainly, one thing, I mean, working with people, and boy, I had this happen. I don't know how many markets I've gone into, and I start selling stuff, and it takes a month, a few weeks, couple months before my distributor, sales rep, whatever I'm doing that market, calls me and says, hey, Craig, I could sell a lot more of this if we could just cut the price by another 5%. Yeah, you could. I'm not trying to sell more stuff. I'm trying to make more money. And so anyway, but the point is there's inherent price pressure, and it's partly because you haven't established yet a strong enough value proposition. Because the value proposition is in fact your protection against having to lower prices. And so again, I may have a value proposition here that's established. I have an established brand. I work with people. They know me. They get it. I don't have to have that. Can you cut your price another 5%? All the time. But in a new market, I'm the new person. I'm new here. I don't have an established value. I'm trying to establish it, but a lot of the people I'm dealing with don't get it yet. Or, I'm working with people who don't understand my value proposition, distributors, sales reps, whatever. In a way, they're not selling value, they're selling price. And I wind up in this downward price spiral. So anyway, so there's both a price lowering dynamic and a cost raising dynamic, both of which, needless to say, undermine your margin. So when you go into a new market, you have to be able to manage both of those things, right? What is going to happen to my costs? And then can I, in fact, establish in this market a position where I can maintain a price that allows me to maintain the margin I need? And then velocity, it's about time between when I get an order and when I get the sale or when I ship and get paid, right? I mean, that's in a way that's what generates our revenue. And so again, I mean, a couple things obviously happen right away. If I am shipping something in ocean freight containers, I mean, suddenly from the time I got the order and the time I'm going to get this and ship it and sell it, it's sitting on a boat for 8 weeks. And then it's got to go through and clear customs and get to my customer, and I may have other pay dynamics. And so the timing of my sales numbers on that same asset base is going to go down. I mean, so almost inherently, my velocity is going to decrease, and therefore my return is going to decrease. So again, I need to understand, so how much is that shift going to be? How important is my business around velocity? And frankly, at some point, if you develop a big enough market, it's this pressure on velocity that's one of the biggest movers to move you to some kind of local sourcing, manufacturing, some way to get your product closer to the place. It's one of the inherent challenges of exporting just to export, is the impact it has on your velocity. So anyway, so the point is, again, I mean, you've been successful here, you're making money, life is good, building the business, growing the business, and now suddenly I'm in a new market. Is this new market actually helping my business become better, stronger, more investable, or is it undermining it? And to understand that, one of the things we got to understand is, what is the impact going to be on our margins? How do we manage that? What is the impact going to be on the velocity in our business? How do we manage that? And can we satisfy ourselves when those come together that we're building a better, stronger business by doing this and not undermining the business? Does that generally make sense? Okay, and then the last piece of this is competitive. Your competitive environment's going to change. And to look at this, I like to use this as sort of a version of Michael Porter's 5 forces. He was a Harvard business professor, who's one of the godfathers of competitive analysis. But the idea is, in general, when we think of competition, we tend to think of us and the people at our level of the marketplace, the same people who generally inhabit our space of what we sell, understanding that if we're good at this, no one sells actually what we sell, because we sell our own unique story and value proposition. But in general, we think of our competitors as, and that's what competition is. But in fact, that's kind of one piece of the competitive environment. It's what he calls rivalry down here, which is, how much price competition is there, how much, how aggressive are people trying to take market share from other movers and going after other people's customers, kind of thing. And that's what we kind of think of as competition. But in fact, the competitive environment involves, obviously, the relationships between customers and suppliers. One of the big things that drives our competitive position is how many of us relative to customers, and how many of us relative to suppliers. The point being that in a market where there are few of us and many customers, we tend to have more price power, because there are a lot of customers and they have fewer choices. Conversely, if there's a lot of us and fewer customers, the customers have more pricing power, because customers have more choices, and if they don't like what we're doing, they can easily get it from somebody else. So obviously, one of the things we're doing as Dynamics going into a new market, expanding into new markets, is simply expanding our customer base. Are we adding customers and therefore increasing, in a way, our competitive position? The problem, of course, is in many new markets, there are also new suppliers. There are people from other countries in our space that we don't see here, but they're there. And so you need to understand, am I going into a market where I'm helping my competitive situation because I'm getting more customers, or am I going into a market where I'm actually going to have a worse competitive situation because of the alternative suppliers? I'm actually going to lose pricing power, if you will. Another big key, the barriers to entry. So this is, everything from our ability to protect our returns through intellectual property protection, government regulation, just things that make it more costly for potential competitors to come into a market where they see us making money. And obviously, those things are very different in different markets. If one of our chief competitive advantages, obviously, is intellectual property, then going into markets where it's hard to protect intellectual property is a tough place to go, and maybe not the place we want to go, because it's going to be hard to maintain our competitive position that allows us, again, to replicate what it is we do successful. And then the last one over there on the right, substitutes. That's the sort of has to do with the thing economists call price elasticity of demand, which is sort of, at what point is something so expensive that I'll simply find another way to solve the problem. It's not that I'm going to go to a competitor of yours. I'm just going to fix my problem some other way. And it's interesting in my experience, what constitutes an acceptable substitute is an incredibly cultural phenomenon. People in different places just have a different view of what are acceptable solutions to a particular problem. And some of it is because they've been solving the same problem for a long time, and they have other solutions available to them. And you may come in with something that seems like a superior solution, or at least here, you've convinced people it's a superior not just to your competitors, but superior to alternative ways of solving that same. So anyway, that becomes another thing we need to be aware of. So the point is, again, in terms of this fourth dimension, we're going to go to a new market. Means to say it's a new market. By definition, our competitive situation is going to change. And so if our goal is to go to markets where we can be successful, meaning whatever it is we're doing here is working, we can do it there and it will work. Or at a minimum, I can identify the things that are significant challenges that are going to be different. And do I have a way to mitigate those challenges so that I can still be successful, even though, it's a little more challenging in that regard. Yeah, my velocity is going to be lower, but I can make that up some other way. Or as I said, sometimes that's a strategy around sourcing things from different places. You're getting more local manufacturing, whatever it's right. Anyway, so that's the key. So hopefully that makes sense. And that to me is the big overarching strategic framework. As I said at the outset, the thing I have found over and over again is when companies struggle with their exporting, it's seldom because they're not doing the right thing. It's because they're doing it in the wrong place. They're just in a market where it ain't going to work. And you can change distributors and you can get a different sales rep and you can do all the things you can try and do. It ain't going to work. You're going to be Campbell's soup. You may as well walk away. I say Campbell's soup can write off $200 and some million. You can't. So better to get it right in the first place. Which then ultimately is the big driver again between, if I look at this, between proactive market selection, deciding strategically where I'm going to go and how I'm going to get there, instead of reactive market selection, winding up in places because I got a call from somebody off my website, or I met somebody at a trade show who seemed like they might be able to be my distributor someplace I hadn't really thought about. So the bottom line in this, and this is the slide I will leave you with on this topic, is, what's driving our strategy? And the 80% of the companies I see who wind up in markets as accidental exporters, they wound up there for some reason other than really looking at their corporate strategy and picking markets where they are going to be successful. It's the tail wagging the dog. Their export strategy starts wagging the company. Returns are going down and we're less profitable, and I have distracted people who are now working on this project that's probably not the best use of their time, as opposed to trying to figure out what is our corporate strategy around growth around expansion, around profitability. And then let's have an export strategy that supports and drives that overall growth. So let's have our dog wagging its tail instead. Okay, so that's the end of my first piece. Is sort of overall. I'm going to switch and give you my thoughts on kind of where is our market. Again, it's not going to be a deep dive because there's a whole separate course on market selection. But I got a couple things I want to just give you as sort of perspective on that. So when you get into that, you have some strategic framework for maybe thinking about it, questions they ask about that. For anything else on what I've done so far before I change gears here? All right. So where is our market? So first thing is, there's in terms of thinking of where a market is, there's three dimensions of a market opportunity we got to think about, right? One is the size of the opportunity. How much sales can we make? How much dollars can we generate? So that's largely a function of customers being there. The cost of accessing the opportunity. Again, the cost of going almost anywhere exporting is going to be more than doing it here. But the key is I need to have a size of opportunity that justifies the additional costs and the things I need to do to my cost structure to make that work. And then there are other risks to our probability of success that exist in different markets, and we need to understand what those are and how do we mitigate them. So, oops, I didn't mean to do that. In terms of size of opportunity, the first thing we need is people. So, one measure of looking at market size, of course, is just, where are there enough people? And so, it's population, it's big markets. It's obviously, one of the attractions to look at a place like China or India or, Germany, take your pick of large markets, Brazil. And then another function of people is population density or major cities. And that's has to do with a logistical challenge, which is that it's obviously easier to get to, ship to, service logistically, provide customer service support to people who are concentrated in a smaller area than it is to look at a country where there's lots of people, but it's spread out over a large geography. And so getting from one to another is sufficiently difficult that I really need to think about smaller chunks of geography. Market size, of course, is just, where are there enough people? And so, it's population, it's big markets. It's obviously, the second thing, of course, we need is we don't just need people, but we need people with money. We need people who are going to spend the money on our product. And so, measures we tend to looking at market size. I mean, we look at gross domestic product or gross domestic product per person in the country. Some other things looking at are other things that tell us that people have, that there's not just money sloshing around in the economy, but people, consumers, actually have disposable income to spend on our products. And so some things you might look at are the percent of people who own cars, cell phones, computers. Some of these work better than others. Cell phones, for example, obviously in a lot of countries are really just communication necessities because that is phone communication. There was no built-out phone system. But, certain things, what are products that tell you people there? And then another measure worth looking at, certainly if you're doing consumer products, is you can get a measure of consumer credit. So that is money that people borrow for personal spending purposes, whether it's credit card debt, home mortgages, car loans, as a percent of GDP. And what you find is that there's a pretty direct correlation on the development curve of countries and the existence of vibrant consumer class economies between sort of the higher percentage there is of consumer debt as a percent of GDP, the more vibrant there is of a sustainable consumer economy. Now, for some of you who are doing more like industrial focused products, that calculation may be a little different because you're less concerned with the consumer economy than with uh, infrastructure build, for example, or industrial development. And in a lot of countries, obviously, that's driven by government expenditures, not consumer expenditures. And so that's a little place to look. But the point is, you got to know there's money there, and the people who would be buying your product are the people who have that money and spend that money, right? So that's the money piece. And then the third thing you need, and this is where I'm going to get to the question about how you find a market for uh, products that haven't been there before, is obviously your customers. I mean, so there's people with money, but that's not enough. This gets to the value proposition thing, right? What you need to know is that those people actually are among your target customers. I mean, when Campbell Soup went to Russia, there were plenty of people there. There actually plenty of people with money to buy soup. It's just they weren't buying Campbell's soup, right? So the question is, are your customers there? And again, there are things you can look at. You can find statistics on just the market size for your product category. You can find statistics on the growth rate for your product or service. So, okay, it's there and it's a growing market, which means there's opportunity expanding in the future. So that's a good thing. Another thing you look at is existing U.S. exports. So on the one hand, that's a helpful thing because it says not only is it there and people buy it, but you can actually export it there and sell it. So something works in terms of the price dynamics in theory. Biggest limitation to that piece of data, of course, is now, again, I'm back to dealing with people who are my nominal competitors here in my market space. And are they there for the right reason? And are they actually making money there? Or are they just selling more stuff and losing money? So it tells me something that I can sell stuff maybe, but it also tells me I'm chasing markets where my competitors are already there, if it's in any volume. So one thing I like to look at more, and this again gets to Rivati's question earlier about kind of finding customers for things that aren't there, which is what I call proxy data for consumer preferences. So the idea here is to think about, okay, I know what my product is and I know what my story is. And so from that, I have some sense of who my likely customers are. But when you get to defining the demographics of who your customers are, beyond how old they are, what kind of environment they live in, gender, all those kind of things, demographics, it helps to identify what other kinds of products or things do the people who tell your story use outside of your product? Are they people who buy certain kinds of clothing? Are they people who drive certain kinds of cars? Are they people who buy iPhones instead of a local manufacturer phone? Sort of what are the characteristics of these ideal people, if I can picture my ideal customer? And then I can maybe find things that, yeah, my product's not there, but I can find something that sort of tells the same story so that if there's a market for that, then that tells me I think there is a market for my product. I'll give you a specific example. I worked a few years ago with a company that sold high-end skincare products. The kind of products, you'd buy through a medi spa or a high-end esthetician business. You couldn't just go get them off the shelf at Walgreens or whatever. And they were looking at exporting, but it was a hard market to find. And indeed, they wanted to kind of get into markets where they could create this. So what are some other things you look at? So one of the things we identified was high-end, or some people would call it designer bottled water. And if you think about, what the story is behind, I mean, water, first, bottled water in itself is kind of a nutty product value-wise, because in many countries, you can get it for free out of the tap, but people go to the store and buy a bottle of it, and they're spending, we worry when gasoline gets above $4, well, hell, you're paying like $12 a gallon for water. It seems nutty, but again, so what is the value proposition in that? And again, we're not talking about like jugs of water in a place where there's an issue with clean water. We're talking about somebody who go to the store and buy Evian water or buy Perrier or buy some expensive bottled water. And if you think about it, the value proposition for that is somebody who is concerned about things that go in their body. They're concerned about, therefore, things that go on their body. They're concerned about health, but we're not talking about health in a, how often I see a doctor kind of way. We're talking about health in terms of the products I buy and the things I consume and how they affect me, right? And that was really sort of the value proposition around this high-end skincare, is that skin is the largest single organ in the human body, and you need to take care of it, right? And it's important what you put on it and how you protect it from the sun, from other elements that can damage it. So the point is they're kind of related things. And so by looking for markets where, people as a percent of consumption or just, people were buying designer bottled water was an indication, at least, that there are people there who tell themselves some story about their personal health and their control over their personal health in terms of the products they buy and the products they put in and on their body, that resonates with the story and the brand story that this company sells. So it's a way to begin to say, okay, there are people and there's money, and I know that, and I feel like my product's a good idea, but are there people there who would buy my story, who tell that story? And I think that's what you got to do, is to, and frankly, I recommend that to even people building businesses here. I mean, far apart from exporting businesses, when I'm going to define my customer and figure out who they are, where they are, how do I reach them? I mean, that's one of the most important things you want to try and figure out about your customer, is what are the other things that customer would buy and consume? Because beyond, like, in this case, are they there? It also tells me where I can find them. Because obviously one of the other big difficulties I have with marketing anywhere, and particularly marketing in a new market, is where do I get my story out that the people I'm trying to communicate with, my customers, are going to hear my story instead of just randomly blasting it everywhere. Right. So if I can find out what are these other kinds of products, services people use, I don't know, there are people who, they do yoga or they go to car racing or, whatever the hell it is. If I can go to those places and get my story told there, I'm far more apt to be telling it in a place where my customers are going to hear it. And therefore, obviously, I'll be way better at marketing and finding customers. Which is probably the biggest single challenge you're going to have going to a new market. Logistics are fixable. You can learn how to ship something better. You can learn how to do, export compliance documentation. You got to do it right. You got to learn it, but you can learn it. Finding your customers and connecting with your customers in a new market is probably going to be your biggest, hardest thing. And so again, understanding who they are and where they are becomes a pretty critical piece of what you need to know and understanding the opportunity. So I want to just a few thoughts on countries. I mean, how do you choose what countries you go? So this is my next poll question. I just asked the question on the top of the slide here. How many countries are there in the world, do you think? And I got three choices. A is 145, B is 195, and C is 200.
Sorry, for some reason it's not launching. I don't know why.
Okay. Well, this is one of the ones I changed the slide on. Well, no, actually, anyway, whatever, doesn't matter. Well, just show of hands. How many people think it's 145? Okay. How many people think it's 195? Okay. Well, there's one going there. How many think it's 205? Okay, a couple there. Okay, good. All right. This is actually the fun thing about this, and the reason I asked the question is the answer is kind of funly ambiguous, even though you'd think this would be a simple question. So the United Nations has 193 members, and sort of 195 because the Holy See and Palestine are both members of the United Nations, but neither are sovereign jurisdictions. On the other hand, there are two countries that have no recognition from the United Nations, but they're recognized by lots of its members. Kosovo is recognized by 110 members of the UN, including the US. It's also a member of the World Bank. And the Republic of China, or Taiwan, is recognized by 21 UN members, although that's declining because of the recent Latin American conference where a couple of people have no longer recognized it. But it's not recognized formally by the US because we have this strategic ambiguity policy, a one country, two policies approach with China. But we do have an official agreement to provide a defense capability, and its trade data is measured by the Department of Commerce separately from China as if it's a separate market. So I don't know, that's 196, it's 197, it's two different 195s. And then just to make it fun and to justify the people who raised their hand at 205, in the 2021 Summer Olympics in Tokyo, the International Olympic Committee welcomed 206 countries. So at least as the Olympics see it, lost my sharing, lost my entire screen. Did you guys see that slide? Did you guys see a slide walking through the numbers of countries?
No.
Okay, I screwed that up. Okay, I had a slide. I mean, I told you the information that was on it. The point is, there's kind of 195 countries, but there's 197, but there's only 193. It depends how you count it. And for Olympic purposes, there are 206, which is a historical crazy thing about the Olympic. Anyway, so for you, came up 205. If you were on the Olympic Committee, you'd be right in the ballpark. For about a year, 195 was at least what the UN would. Anyway, so the point is, there's lots of countries. And then the next question is, if I'm thinking about export strategy, is okay, but where in those countries should I be? And I apologize because this is what I managed to keep doing, which is to somehow screw up how I share slides. All right, this is the slide I just went through that you didn't get to see. Hopefully you see it. Okay, so that's the answer on how many countries there are. No one knows. Even the United Nations doesn't know how many countries there are in the world. So we're all excused for not knowing the exact number ourselves. Anyway, so what do you do with that information? Well, so again, if you're talking about where the money is, and we look simply at first just gross domestic product. Here's the IMF's, the International Monetary Fund's data. And this is the top 20 countries ranked by gross domestic product. You can see the United States is the largest economy in the world, still by far. China has come on very fast over the last 10 or 15 years. At 19 trillion, it is far and away the second largest economy in the world. No one's really close because then you drop all the way to Japan at 4.4 trillion for the next. You can see by the time you get to number 20, countries' GDPs are actually below $1 trillion. So again, when you look at the United States at 26 trillion, almost 27 trillion, China at 19 trillion, those are far and away the largest markets in the world relative to at least money. One interesting cut on all this, again, if I'm taking a broad brush cut, if I just take this top 20 and then add in the balance of the European Union, if I'm thinking of that as one market, we could argue as one market, many markets. And it's not adding in that much more because the big ones, obviously Germany, France, Italy, are already in the top 20 list. But if I just add in those a few more to the top 20, that accounts for almost 85% of all world economic activity. Which is just to say that, if I'm looking at a broad brush cut and I want to go to where there's money and where there's markets with lots of people and money, I mean, this is kind of your list. Now, having said that, obviously, again, value proposition is important. You may have a product that works really well in many other particular countries. And as long as you can go through the analysis and justify or satisfy yourself, you can, in fact, do that profitably and effectively, absolutely go for it. That's not to discourage you from going to other countries. It's just saying if I start this, if I got 195, how do I make the big cut? Here's one of your first big cuts. Now, the other thing you can argue about this, for what it's worth, is, okay, yeah, that's gross money slogging around in the economy, but how about GDP per capita? How much money is there per person? And that reshuffles this deck quite a bit. In fact, the number one thing that happens is that all of the developing countries on this list, including China, India, every one of them, Brazil, Russia, Indonesia, Turkey, all drop off this list by quite a bit. And in fact, of those, China and Russia, I think, are the only two that actually wind up above the world median gross domestic product per capita. And what happens on the other end is a lot of small, very wealthy countries like Luxembourg, shuffle to the top because they got a lot of money and a few people. And again, so depending on what your market is and who you're looking for, that creates a group of countries that are worth looking at. Again, the EU, once you're in the EU successfully, there are certainly logistical, accounting, financial reasons why expanding further in the EU makes sense as a market. And some of those, at least, would be outside of this list. But anyway, I just think that's an interesting, big cut on where my market is. The other strategic thing I want to note about sort of how do I cut markets, how do I decide here or there? In doing international business for many years, this right here is the biggest single differentiator I see in markets between two types of markets. And the point of this slide, I have the average hourly manufacturing wage in the U.S. You can see is over $21 an hour. The average manufacturing wage in a selection of developing countries, is a couple bucks an hour. Even China is far and away the second largest economy, is way, way below the United States average. And the reason it's important is that's what defines the difference between countries that, on the one hand, labor is more expensive than materials, versus countries, on the other hand, where materials are more expensive than labor. That's like one of the biggest easy divides between understanding what's going to work in this country and what's going to work in that country. Because in countries where labor is far more expensive than materials, what works are products that prefabricate things that kind of get all the labor out of my problem. If you can streamline my labor problem and I just have to deal with materials, that's a good deal. But if you're in a market where materials are more expensive than labor, and a large part of what you're doing, and again, this is particularly relevant to American companies wanting to export, because, of course, you're in a market where labor is more expensive than materials. So a large part of what you look at are things that take labor out of the equation because it makes your operation more effective, more whatever. Well, in a country where labor costs a couple bucks an hour, that's just not that exciting in terms of what it is you're going to do for me. Because labor is the easy way to solve almost any problem. It's the cheapest way to solve any problem, that's for sure. And I just want to go back to this slide for a minute, because this is a real world thing. And having been in many, the business I was in for much of my career was a manufacturing business, operating manufacturing plants around the world. And this is very much the different pictures you see. These are both auto lines, one in the United States, one in China. And you see the one in the United States, I'm looking at a lineup of 1, 2, at least 3 car bodies there, and kind of maybe one person. On a manufacturing line like that in the United States, you might have 3 people on the line. You got a person on the front end, who's supervising, making sure the things going into the line are getting in and there's no problem, there's no jam, there's nothing that needs to be readjusted. You got somebody in the back end making sure that the stuff that's coming off and going to the palletizer or whatever you're doing to get it ready for shipping logistics is working. And you might have a person in the middle looking at a computer screen that's monitoring temperature or chemical mix or whatever is going on the line. Conversely, here's a new car line in China, and I got one car body, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I can count at least 8 people working on one car body. And I have been in plants where I've done operations in other countries and run into exactly that in our plants. I mean, I have plants making the exact same product, and somewhere else I have literally 5, 6, 10 times as many people working in the assembly, only because labor is a cheaper solution. And so then that gets in, particularly for you all selling products into industrial applications. I mean, again, if in any way your product is about, saving labor, making things less time consuming, a super good proposition in a developed country with high labor costs. Not a winner, mostly in countries where labor costs are super low. Doesn't matter. Anyway, so I want to point that out because that's one of the, as I've seen in all the years I've done this, maybe the biggest single cut of I should go here and not there is which dynamic is that? Is labor more expensive than materials, or materials more expensive than labor? And if I understand that, I can understand a large part of what I need to know about the economic dynamics in a particular country and how it's going to affect my. Okay, so the next piece says that's kind of market size, market choice. Another piece is the cost. And of course, there's direct cost. And I talked about some of this earlier, just in terms of what happens to your financial dynamics. Packaging and shipping distances, your shipping cost is going to be more. If you're going to have a product sit on an ocean freight container for 6 or 8 weeks, and if you know what happens to weather in the middle of the ocean at different times of year, frequently you need some specialized packaging so your product actually gets to your customer in the condition it needs to be in. Compliance testing and certification. I mean, if you need fire testing, electrical testing, various things, that all takes time and expense to get certification. If you're responding to particular needs, I mean, just to change design and therefore change how you manufacture things, make tooling changes in your manufacturing plants. Foreign language materials, whether it's marketing materials or instruction manuals for users, or consumer mandated consumer labeling requirements. There's lots of things that are going to need to get translated in the first case, but more importantly, then get many more different sort of inventory of printed items because I have to have these in lots of different languages in different places. Service and support personnel. Obviously, I'm meeting different demands in different languages and different time zones. Travel, whether it's management people going to put deals together or it's service people going to solve problems. It obviously costs more to travel halfway around the world than to travel to Kansas City. Legal compliance. I mean, obviously, I got that many more legal regimes to start with. So I need lawyers just like here. I mean, if I'm doing business in different states, I need access to lawyers who can give me advice about the particular state laws. Well, now every country I'm in has a different regime. I need somebody who knows something about it. And again, if intellectual property is a key part of my business, I need to protect that intellectual property in every market I'm in. And that takes costs everywhere I go. Beyond the direct costs, though, there are also indirect costs I face. My working capital cost is going to go up simply because I'm going to have more inventory, at least if I have specialized product that I'm shipping to different places. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, but also my receivables are going to go up, probably, at least if I'm selling on credit, just partly because of the time it takes to get things off my loading dock to my customer. They have it, they pay me, I get payment. There's a huge cost generally in terms of diversion of time and resources. This is particularly true in smaller companies where I'm not going to go out and hire a brand new director of export operations, but I'm going to ask Sally, who's been doing our shipping and receiving to California and New York, to now figure out how to ship and receive to Guadalajara or somewhere else. You're taking people who presumably have a full-time job and asking them to do what really, in many ways, is a really different, separate job. So the question is, what happens there in terms of balls getting dropped and things not getting done correctly? And training and education. And that's both, training and educating your people here about a new market, whether that's cultural sensitivity, people are going to be traveling to markets to do deals, to work with customers, to whatnot, who need to know how to get around and how to operate and how to not be idiots when they're in another country. And as well as training for people there. I mean, if you have a distributor, a sales rep, whatever it is, you need them to understand what you do. You need them to understand your company culture. You really need them to understand your value proposition. And so, it's kind of a two-way street. When I've done this, I have generally tried to get those people at some point to come and visit us here and to spend a few days in our plant and spend some time on the road with one of our salespeople and, see how we do things here. What is our pitch? What is our story? Rather than just setting them loose and hoping to hell based on a couple of meetings at a trade show and the time we sign the agreement that they got it, they're good, they're ready to go. So anyway, so those are all costs. And again, gets back to the point I made earlier about our costs are going up. And we need to know how we're going to manage that and still stay profitable. And then the other thing that happens is sort of these other risks and probabilities of success. So one is what I call local barriers to entry. Again, anytime there's some kind of code requirement, whether it's a fire code or an electrical code, a health, safety, consumer regulation kind of code. I mean, we'd like to think that these things are all like designed in a sense of scientific objectivity as to the thing to make us all safer, better. The reality is, they're mostly not. A lot of it is political judgment calls, and a lot of it is designed to protect the domestic market. They are, think about how code things get designed here. They're generally designed by people in our industry, and it may be a combination of suppliers, consumers, manufacturers, whatever. But those are the people coming up with the rules. And the same thing is true in other countries. So if the other country has a domestic industry in your area, I will guarantee you that their local compliance regulations are designed to make it easier for their people and harder for foreign competitors to come. It just is. Not a lot you can do about it other than to know it and appreciate it and understand what you have to comply with and how to do it. Cultural technology preferences. This relates back a little bit to what I was saying earlier about substitutes and what constitutes a particular substitute. There are, again, people in other countries, I mean, they've been solving this problem. They weren't sitting around waiting for you to come solve their problem. And so, frequently they have a way of doing something. And it may be culturally imbued as to that's just the way we do it. It's the way we think about it. And that's fine. But you got to understand that makes it harder for you to sell when you think your idea is the best ever. I can tell you in my world, I sold mostly, and again, the company I worked for made building products, construction materials. And, construction all around the world is a very cultural industry because it's mostly at the contractor end of things, a family business. And it's frequently something where, as people come up in the business, the kids learn the skills from their mother, their father, whatever. And they have a way of doing things. And you may come in with a product that you just think is the greatest thing ever. And they're going to be like, yeah, it's just not the way we do it. And that's the way it is. So anyway, you just got to know that in other markets, in other cultural environments, they just health, safety, consumer regulation kind of code. Way of thinking about the problem you're trying to solve. We'd like to think that these things are all like designed in a sense of scientific objectivity as to the thing. Another local competitors and potential competitors. The reality is, they're mostly not. Again, a lot of it is political judgment calls. A lot of markets, and a lot of it is designed to protect in your domestic market. You don't know about going in because they're not here, but they're there. And they obviously have some advantages. They're local. They know the people. They know the market. Their people are all local. Um, it also can create issues around intellectual property questions. I mean, there's one of the challenges for foreign business or American businesses doing business in China over the years of, reverse engineering things and how much intellectual property protection do you really get legally, those kind of things. And then price pressures, because, if you're able to export a product from here to there and do it profitably, there's a pretty good chance there's some enterprising person there looking at you going, doing that, wow, we could make that here and we can make it a lot cheaper and we can have local customer service and people who know the customers, and probably do that as well. And again, I've seen specific examples, including one market I had where we had built up a pretty sizable export market, and almost overnight, a local manufacturer popped up making a product that honestly I don't think was as good as ours. And it didn't wipe us out entirely, but it sure took a big chunk of our market suddenly because they underpriced us like crazy. And they had a certain percent of people who they were able to just through local affiliations and connections convince people that they were the local people. That's who you had. So anyway, so you need to see that coming down the pike as a problem. And then beyond that, there's an issue with other foreign competitors. And the first advantage, and this is the situation where, again, I know my market here, I know who's in it here, and now I go somewhere else. And there may be a company there you have never encountered or never heard of because they don't do business in the United States. But they're from South Korea, they're from Italy, they're from, take your pick. And they own the market you're going into. They've been there for 50 years doing this. It's just nobody you've ever run into and never been on your radar screen. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about kind of how you find these people before you go there to know that's going to happen. But again, and this is not a hypothetical. I've seen it happen in the real world. I've seen it happen to me where I've wound up in a market and then there's been somebody from another country who I literally have never heard of before, and they control the new market I'm going into. Just the way it is. So anyway, so again, and that's part of doing, market research again, which again, I'm going to talk a little bit later about kind of, how do you do good market research in order to get the answers to those kind of things so you don't get tripped up by that kind of risk thing. And then lastly, internal cultural changes, and I have a whole shtick on that, so I'm not going to dwell on that now. I'm going to cover that. That's our third element I'm going to talk about. But it's a big one and potentially damaging. So anyway, so big picture on selecting markets. We have more or less 195 countries in the world. There are a few things you can do to make a big cut of, labor versus materials, materials versus labor. Where are there enough people and enough money to even make it? Looking at, is it the top 20, the top 30? Is it a few particular countries I've identified? And then what we want to get down to is, where are the markets that we are going to be successful, right? And then this gets down to getting further down into what is our value proposition? What's our competitive advantage? What's our financial dynamics in terms of how we generate a return to make money? And get down to the ones that work. And that's what, at the end of the day, that's what market selection is about. If I'm going to be proactive and not just wind up with my people with their hair on fire, is I wind up in places I really shouldn't be because I got there for reasons that were pretty random. Let's avoid that. So the last thing I want to talk about in this piece, and just a couple things on, so that's market, where do I find this stuff that allows me to kind of make this kind of selection or get this market intelligence? So first is, people like the World Trade Center. I mean, obviously the World Trade Center, as those who are here have begun to figure out at least, is a great resource for market data and help in understanding markets, what's going on there, who's there, as well as just financial economic statistics. Tori mentioned, well, I think she was talking about Manufacturer's Edge, but government resources, the United States Export Assistance Center, or USIAC, is an office of the Department of Commerce. that provides support to American companies doing exporting. USIAC has an office here in Denver, and it's a great resource. In addition, the state has an office, the Colorado International Trade Office. I have it abbreviated here. Sometimes they call it something different. The Denver Economic Development Office, or DADO. Both of those people have people very focused on helping, in the state's case, Colorado companies, in Denver's case, Denver companies succeed in international business. And then, of course, there's all kinds of flavors of private consultants that can help you with particular industries, particular markets, who have a lot of information, know what to do. But the first several of those are great, of course, because the World Trade Center does both services for members, which is stupidly cheap and reasonable. Become a member if you're not already. And then also has other programs you can do that are some are free, some are priced, but all reasonable. Most of what the USIAC, CEDO, DIDO do is mostly free resources. The USIAC can do a search called a gold key search, which costs some money, but it's still super cost effective. Anyway, so that's number one. Number two on my list, things to look at, there's a website called Global Edge. It's actually hosted by Michigan State University. It's just a great website for doing research on potential markets. When you've identified some companies and you just want to find out things like, what is the GDP per capita? What are their principal industries? What are their main imports, their main exports? It's got a lot of great data, as well as some editorial insight. It was created partly for academic research, but also as part of their trade development center there. And so anyways, that's a handy resource. And the other nice thing is, while there's a piece of it that's behind a paywall, most of it is free. And particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, I like free because you can get a lot of good information, not have to pay for it. Another great free resource for data on markets is the CIA World Factbook. Many people may not know this, but this is the single most valuable thing the Central Intelligence Agency does for the private sector. When the CIA is out there doing its intelligence work and gathering information on other countries, among the data they're gathering is data on industries, on economy, on political risk, on all kinds of things. And they helpfully publish it to their library online, and it's accessible. And so for any given market, you should find the CIA World Factbook report on that country and see what the CIA has to say about it. Again, in addition to the general economic data, which is all there, it's also very good, obviously, at surfacing political risk that might exist for American companies. Similar to that is the Country Commercial Guides, which is published by the Department of Commerce and found through their site at export.gov. Similar to the World Factbook, I actually like the World Factbook better. I think the CIA actually does a better job than the Department of Commerce at explaining what intelligence they have on countries, but a lot of the data is pretty similar. There's a site called Nation Master. I like this and put this out there because it's a site that they have data like, how many personal computers are there per capita in a particular country? How many hospital beds are there per capita in a particular market? And so when you get down, particularly this idea of like, I'm thinking about other products that are not my product that I'd like to find something about, or is it there, or how do they correlate to other products? This is a site that frequently has that kind of data. And again, it's free, which is fantastic. Purchased market studies. This is not free. There are people who will do very detailed market studies. The problem with this for small and medium-sized businesses is really good ones cost like $100,000 or more. So I got them at a huge company. I would never get them at a small company. Obviously, internet searches, duh. I do want to highlight topical blogs here. So most business schools in the United States have programs abroad. And so in almost every country, there's some American business professor who's there. And, they have things to say, and they frequently have blogs out there. And so, again, if you're looking at a particular market and you're trying to understand the business dynamics, frequently in many markets, you can find a blog written by an American business professor about what goes on in that market. And it's just a great way to get some interesting, different business-oriented insight beyond just statistics and numbers and the kind of things you get otherwise. Obviously, books. The Economist is a magazine I recommend, in part because, well, it's in English, it's British, and so it's nice because it frequently gives you an economic and political perspective on other markets that is a non-American perspective, and so it helps get you a little outside of our bubble, and therefore useful. Travel guides, and by that I mean Lonely Planet, Frommer's, you know exactly what you think of, and mainly because in almost every travel guide there's a section in the beginning that has political history, cultural history, and particularly if you're going to travel to another country to start to make connections, you check it out. You should actually do some research. And it's a handy place to get a book that tells you some very useful things about a market. Foreign phone books. So, phone books are still a thing. They're becoming less and less of a thing. But again, if you go to a market someplace, just like here frequently when you open up the bedside table in your hotel room, there's a yellow pages. That's true in a lot of other countries too. And if you look in the yellow pages, it's amazing what you can find out about companies that are there in your marketplace, who are suppliers, who are contractors, how is the marketplace built. In one case, I can tell you, I actually found somebody who had stolen our trade name and was using our trademark in another country because I found it in the yellow pages on a business trip. So you can find things there. And then my last starred one, I like to talk about this, trade shows. And here's what I mean by this. A lot of people, when they think of trade shows, they think of the thing you go to after you're already in a market to start to market your goods. But I'm here to tell you that once you get serious about a market, this is the number one place you should go for market research. I mean, in almost every industry in the world, there is a major trade show dedicated to a region, or if it's a large enough country, a country. I mean, you will find trade shows for this in most industries in Mexico, in China, in Japan, in Germany. And so if you're satisfied, this is where I'm thinking of going, find the next big trade show in your industry near in that market and go to it. Because if you think about it, what a trade show does is it takes your industry and concentrates the whole thing into a floor or two of a convention center over the course of a couple days. And so if you go and buy a visitor's ticket to that and just walk around and talk to people, you'll see who are all the other people in the industry. And this is where you're going to surface the foreign competitor you've never heard of here because they're from South Korea and they don't do business in the United States. But they're a killer in the market you're thinking of going to, right? Who are the local competitors? You can start to get a handle on product redesign. What kind of things, like we think of product this way, but it turns out when I go there, the colors are different, the sizes and shapes are different. It turns out the fit in places in another market, things need to be narrower, taller, just how people use things. It's remarkable how many times I've been to trade shows in other countries and a thing where, I have this hubristic idea that, well, we're the most advanced economy in the world, so we have cutting edge technology. And then I go to someplace and I am blown away by what I see. I mean, I see stuff that's not going to be in the United States for another 5 or 10 years. And that's for a number of reasons. I mean, partly because we have a highly litigious economy, and so taking risks sometimes and introducing new products is actually more difficult here than some places. Some of it, I say, there are people out there who have been thinking about these problems and they're super creative and have designed amazing stuff. Anyway, so it's worth it for that. And then again, who are the people in the market? Like, what are the levels in the supply chain, right? Who are the suppliers? Who are the distributors? Just like big trade shows here, different people at different levels of the market there. If you want to get pricing data, competitive pricing data, wow, nothing beats walking around a trade show and acting a little dumb. And like trade shows everywhere, there are salespeople at the booth who are bored out of their minds looking for anybody to talk to kill some time. And you act a little dumb. I mean, it's amazing the kind of information you get about their pricing and price structure and discounting. And well, they just talking about, what they do, are they selling, how do you price that thing? Anyway, so the point is, if I'm going to do market research on a market, once I'm serious, I mean, and again, this is not after I'm already there, but when I'm ready to say, okay, I'm pretty settled. I've narrowed it down to a couple places. How do I get there successfully? What are the things I really need to know about that market to know that I can make this work? Or what adjustments do I need to know to make it work? That's where you go. Find a trade show, go there. So that's my pitch about that. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears again. And what I want to talk about as a sort of existential strategic issue when you do exporting is the external challenges we face that are different, and then what that does to us internally in terms of understanding our own company dynamics and culture and objectives. Before I launch into that, let me just, as we're kind of changing subjects again, anything about what I've talked about so far or what I finished up before the break? Anybody has anything they want to toss in? Or okay, all right. So I'm going to start this piece with a story that is purposely a little old. It may seem dated, but the datedness is exactly the point of the story, if you will. So I don't know how many of you remember or were aware of a thing called MySpace, but MySpace was at one point the big US social media marketing platform. MySpace had over 75% of the United States market share for social networking sites. Facebook was a distant number two with a little over 12%. And then there were a whole bunch of companies that were trying to get into the space and just couldn't. At the time, MySpace sold 180 million of the 280 million spent on online advertising and social networking sites in the US. Now, one indication that's dated is, of course, with the explosion of social media, that number today is more like $200 billion in terms of total market size. But still, at the time, I mean, MySpace was the big player. And so they were the big player in terms of users, in terms of subscribers. They were, in fact, the big player in terms of being able to monetize that. It was obviously a rapidly growing market, and they were the people to be. And in fact, they had such a commanding share that MySpace was bought by News Corporation, which is the same company that owns the Wall Street Journal. They own Fox News. A large company at the time. They had $30 billion in revenue, $62 billion in assets. They were number 84 on the Fortune 500 list of companies. So the point is, I got a company that is the market owner far and away in terms of both market share and money. And they have the financial backing of a huge company with, relatively speaking, sort of endless supplies of money to go do what they wanted to do. And the question is, what could possibly happen when a company with a hot growing technology, a dominant US market position, and strong financial resources seeks to take their business international? Which brings us to my next poll question. Or is this one going to go up, or I can just read it if not? We do a show.
This one should work. I think I figured out what the problem was.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So, which of the following challenges was not faced by MySpace in trying to go international? Internet speeds in some countries were much, right? It's not all there. I have it written here anyway. Internet speeds in some countries were much higher in the US, making the MySpace experience slow and uninteresting. B, adults over 50 using MySpace had already made the site uncool for teenagers in some target markets. Or C, and C, users in some cultures were unfamiliar with how to interact appropriately online with members of the opposite sex. And the question is, which one of those were not faced by MySpace? So way faster internet speeds, people over 50 making it uncool, or people having difficulty figuring out how you interact with the opposite sex online. We're almost there. Two more people. Anybody else want to weigh in? There's no right. There's not. You're not going to get graded on the test. So whatever your best guess is good. Okay. So interesting on this one. Boy, I finally won one. If this were a game of, you ask the question and you see how many people you can fool. In fact, the correct answer to this is adults over 50 using MySpace had already made the site uncool. The internet speed issue was actually a significant issue. I forget whether I have to hit share anyway. So most people went with the internet speed thing, which kind of makes sense. And again, that's one of those, partly from an American perspective. I mean, we tend to think we've got this thing wired. We don't. The reality is other people had the internet and figured out how to do high-speed internet before we did. So the fact is that when MySpace did this, they actually faced a litany of like every nightmare problem you could possibly face or get wrong doing exporting. So one is they misjudged market size in a couple key markets. And they misjudged it by kind of misunderstanding what their market is. I mean, how a company could do this. But for example, they went big into Russia because Russia had one of the fastest expanding spaces for personal computer use and internet access per person. The problem, of course, is that MySpace doesn't make its money by having users, just like Facebook doesn't today. They make money by selling advertising to people who want to reach those users. And while Russia had a rapidly expanding base of internet users, the companies weren't spending money on social media advertising. The social media advertising market was like flatline dead. It wasn't a thing. And part of that was just where Russia's former Soviet Union was in the course of just developing its sort of commercial capitalistic economy, generally speaking. But anyway, so they just totally misjudged. They put in way more money than it turns out they could ever possibly make on it. A second thing they misjudged was the competitive landscape. Again, this was the assumption that, well, if you're the market leader in the United States, then you're almost per force the market leader everywhere. Except the problem is they went into a lot of other markets and there was already somebody there doing it. And by the way, they were already doing it in that language and with a cultural sensitivity to the users in that place. And of course, since it's social networking, I mean, talk about things that are inherently cultural. Anyway, and then interestingly, it was the first sort of view of the future in terms of being owned by Facebook. That when they went into England specifically, Facebook, when they started to go international, instead of doing what MySpace did, which was to try and go everywhere, Facebook took a couple markets, one of them being England, and said, let's get that right. And actually, by the time MySpace tried to go into England, Facebook actually was the one market Facebook was already way ahead of. And so sort of a harbinger of things to come. Language barriers. I can't just say, I mean, obviously, they got a website. The whole thing is based on language. It's bad enough or hard enough to have to retranslate all your stuff. In their case, of course, a lot of it depends on the computer code underneath it that generates it. And so not only were there different languages, but for example, they were going into countries where people read right to left instead of left to right. And that requires a whole different kind of computer code just to get websites and things to move that direction as they load and people enter data. cultural perspectives. A number of big examples of this where they tripped up. One was to the third bullet on my question. In a number of countries, particularly in the Middle East, in a lot of these places, I mean, there was not a lot of social interaction other than very supervised social interaction between members, particularly teenagers of the opposite sex. And suddenly here they are online with the opportunity to social network. And they had to do a lot of training and create extra modules and other, parental supervision walls and things that allowed them to even be there and control sort of how that happened. Another place it was a big problem is Japan. If you know anything about the culture in Japan, the culture in Japan is a very group-oriented culture. MySpace, of course, was all about my space. It was about me, the individual, and most of you probably don't even know MySpace. My kids happen to be an age when MySpace was the thing. But there was a whole bar on MySpace where the whole point of it was that you put my favorite bands and my favorite movies and whatever my thing is, and I created a my thing. And in Japan, that was like exactly the opposite of what people wanted to be. They didn't want to be talking about my thing, how I'm different. They wanted to know how I'm part of the group. So they almost had to change the whole thing and make it like more like our space. Because instead of like all that, here's my things, they had groups of, affiliate groups you could join to become part of a group. And so that required a whole rework of what the whole thing was about. And then the complementary infrastructure. This is the internet speed thing. They actually faced both sides of this. There were some countries they went into where the internet speeds were too slow. And so things just took time to load and it was gummy and it was just awful. But there were some places, South Korea in particular, already had pretty much universal high-speed internet before we did. And they already had, their internet sites already had a lot of streaming video and other things happening that at the time most American internet sites didn't have. And people were like, I don't get it. I mean, you sign on, you load up, and you just have like a page with words on it. Like, that's not interesting. And so it didn't make it. So the point is, they just had, like I say, every nightmare you could picture. And I don't know as to say that the reason MySpace ultimately practically disappeared. It hasn't entirely disappeared. It actually still exists as a very niche social media marketing place in the music industry. It's a place mainly where I think indie rock bands connect to talk about music and kind of what's happening in that area. But it's certainly fallen from grace as any kind of major thing. How much of that was attributable to this? I don't know. Maybe Facebook was just a better thing, better happening. MySpace lost its way. A big corporation like News Corp just and so things just took time to load, and it was gummy, and it was just social networking. But there were some places, South Korea, but I have to believe that the amount already had pretty much they poured into this venture before we only to have, and they already had their internet sites already had a lot of failure, streaming video everywhere they went, things happening failed to anticipate. Most American what seemed to be some internet basic challenges, like what do I actually sell? I sell people were like, I don't get it. Internet use. I mean, you sign on, you load up, and you just there are going to be cultural differences. I mean, social networking, it's a cultural thing. Duh. And so it just maybe there's going to be somebody in Brazil who already does. So the point is, they just had in Portuguese every night in a culturally coherent way. And so things just come in to load, and it was gummy, and it was just awful. But there were some all those things. South Korea, I think about, they didn't. They already had pretty much universal high-speed internet, and we're going to do this. Before we did, and they already had their internet sites already had a lot of streaming video and other things happening that at the time most American. So just interesting to internet sites wrap this story up. And people so this is MySpace's own perspective on its efforts. This is a couple of quotes from the guy who was in charge of this effort. Launching in these countries won't generate much revenue anytime soon. Or my other favorite, we're looking at places where there's not a ton of money to be made in the next 5 to 10 years. Ouch. This is from Travis Katz, who's the managing director of international operations, is quoted in the Wall Street Journal. while they were in the middle of this tremendous effort. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that would be a tough sell to most of the people I work for, like the chairman of the board of the company I worked at. If I were telling, oh, don't worry, we got a great international business strategy. We're going to places where you can't make money, and if you do, it'll be another 5 to 10 years. Like, yeah, no. And obviously, particularly with businesses like ours, smaller, medium-sized businesses, just like we can't write off $200 million like Campbell Soup. I don't think we can spend 5 or 10 years screwing around with something, hoping to hell we eventually make some money. So all that's to say that these challenges are out there. This is by no means an exercise meant to scare anyone away. I'm a big believer, obviously, in international business and exporting and marketing, which is why I'm so involved in this stuff. But it's got to be done right. So then the question is, okay, so that's what happened to MySpace. What do we do with our space? And again, it's sort of the point of beginning this journey. I mean, you should plan with intention, be proactive. Don't wind up in some crazy place when it's not the place you ought to be, because you might lose your shirt. Do the due diligence as you pick a market. Do the market research. Find out what is going on there. Are your customers there? Who are the other competitors? How's that competitive environment going to change? Can I hire the employees I need and supervise them in a way to create the customer service experience I'm trying to create? Can I manage my supply chain in a way that I can actually deliver the value I'm trying to deliver? And as I said, with my tail wagging dog issue, let your business goals drive your strategy, not the other way around. Go to places you're going to win, not just places because it happened. So decide why and where you're going to go before you decide how you're going to get there. So that's all the external things that can happen. And then those are disruptive enough. But if not aware of it, managed correctly, all of those things, and even things that you sort of already know about and anticipate, will drive things internally, so that one of the biggest challenges companies face sometimes when they go new in international markets is a cultural problem. But it's not the external culture of the country they're going into. It's what happens to the internal culture of the business they're trying to run and the way they've traditionally run it. And so I want to talk for a minute about what some of those things are. So as I'm getting ready, I'm thinking about, are we ready to do this? And there's lots of talk about, are we ready? And usually it's talking about, do we know how to do letters of credit? Do we have somebody who understands compliance documentation? And all that's important. You need to know that. You can learn that. But you also need to know some other things that are going to happen to your business when you start to do this. I mean, one is we talked about design preferences. And the fact is that people in other countries sometimes like things in different colors than we use here. Or if it's something that has to fit into someone's apartment or living space, people's living spaces are very different dimensions. And so that things need to be narrower or shorter or just different in order to just fit in the kind of spaces things have to fit in. A simple design thing is not even so much a preference, but just electrical codes. I mean, anyone who's traveled knows that, any group of countries you go to is going to have a whole different plug at the end of something. And so if you sell anything that requires power and has to be plugged into a socket, you need to have the right plug on the end of it. Or it's simply not going to work, right? So when you start to talking about manufacturing changes, things I need to make my product a little differently before I send it to Germany or Japan or Argentina, then I need to make tooling changes in my manufacturing lines. I need to change over how I do it because I'm now making something that's a little unique. I need to feed in a different product in order to get it to come out the right way on the back end. Needless to say, that's going to drive your operations people, the people running your manufacturing line, crazy because, one, they got to make the changes, but more importantly, to make those changes, they have to shut the line down in order to make the changes. And nothing ticks manufacturing people off more than having to shut the line down in order to do a changeover for something that, why are we doing this? Inventory SKUs units are gonna go up on both ends of the project. I mean, if I have to make special product in some way in any of these ways, different color, different size, different shape, different electrical plug on the end of it, for particular markets, I am both going to have more inventory on the raw material end because I have to stock those additional plugs. I have to stock the color powder that's going to color code or powder coat the thing in terracotta instead of the standard, blue and red we do here. And I'm going to obviously have more inventory on the back end as well, because as I produce these things and accumulate them on my warehouse floor in order to get a container load that I'm going to ship out, I'm now storing that as well. Obviously, customer service changes. It changes in terms of time zones. I may hear if all I have is an American business, domestic business, I may well have customer service that operate, we're available from 8 in the morning till 5 at night or 6 at night. That's all great until you have customers who they're having a problem with your thing in the middle of the night because it's the middle of the day their time. And who do they call? How do they get an answer? Some of that obviously can be resolved by email, but even then they may have expectations for how soon am I going to get an answer? When is somebody going to come in and see my email? And then there are obviously cultural sensitivities. Anytime somebody's interacting with customers, they need to be people who have had some kind of cultural acuity, some kind of cultural sensitivity training to understand the context of questions and problems and how to deal with them and who should I be talking to and those kind of things. Shipping logistics, obviously changes because now instead of just putting something on a truck for a short haul, I'm putting things in ocean freight containers. And that may require different shapes and sizes in terms of how they get stacked, how to optimize what I can pack in terms of what things weigh and what my maximum weight is. And then even more than the container itself, that container is going to get someplace to a port where it's going to be unloaded. And then it's going to get to your final customer through drayage, which means it's going to get out of the container and put on some truck. Then in many cases, it's going to look very different than the trucks we have here. They're going to be narrower, they're going to be shorter, they're going to be taller. And so if your stuff is palletized or boxed or crated in order to fit really nicely, too wide and too high in a standard American semi-trailer or an ocean freight container, they're going to make it fit. And that may require completely undoing your packaging and your palletizing in order to make it fit on their truck. So get ready for that ride. So you got to understand the whole way of shipping. How's it going to get? Where's it going to disembark from? Where's it going to arrive? And then what's the drayage going to look on the other end that's going to get it from where it arrives to where it gets to my customer? Another version of customer service, obviously, is language. Are the people who are going to be calling, do they all speak English? Do they speak American English or do they speak international business English? Do the people I have answering the phone, responding to emails, answering questions, are they able to understand and comprehend? Or should I start hiring people? Is this market important to me enough that I should have customer service people who can actually respond to questions not only in the right time zone, but in the right language? Credit terms. Boy, nothing will set your credit department or finance department's hair on fire like what you're about to do with credit. When you first start to export, maybe you can do a cash up front kind of deal. Letters of credit are a thing a lot of people talk about. The World Trade Center does a whole course on them, I think. They're great, but in my experience, even letters of credit are problematic. Because for one thing, to get a letter of credit, you usually have to post an equivalent amount of the letter of credit for security. So even though I don't have to send you the $50,000 in advance, I have to tie $50,000 up with the bank to secure the letter of credit. And that's a problem for me as a customer. Plus, letters of credit themselves are not perfect solutions to getting paid just because there's so many rules about how the documentation has to match exactly between the shipping invoice and the bill of lading and the letter of credit. And then things happen. Your thing gets to the boat, something's wrong with the boat, it winds up on a different boat. It winds up going a different day to a different port. And all of a sudden your letter of credit is non-conforming and you have a payment problem. But the ultimate reality is that if you build an export market that is big enough, good enough, you're a big enough player there, you're going to offer credit terms. Because just like here, most stuff is sold on credit. But then here's the problem. It's one thing to have a customer here where I give you 30 days or maybe 45 days even. I ship it, I get it, you get paid. But now this thing, first of all, is probably going to sit on a boat for 6 or 8 weeks. And then it's going to get someplace in a market where, in my experience, particularly some markets, they might even have 60 to 90-day credit terms. And if you're going to be a real player in this market, credit terms is a key place of being, price competitive. If you have a good value proposition, actually credit terms are almost more sensitive than the price itself. How long do I have to pay? Because I want to be able to get your product and then obviously turn it around in my cycle to be able to sell it to generate the cash to pay you, which is the whole point of getting it on credit. So anyway, the point is by the time I take my, on it, ship it, 8 weeks on the boat, matching local credit terms, and then deal with anything there's to deal with, just, the transfer of funds. I may wind up having a situation where I'm shipping goods out and I'm not getting paid for 120 days. And so, you need to understand that that's a reality. But again, particularly in companies where one of their drivers is to reduce working capital, i.e. reduce the amount of money I have tied up in receivables. I mean, this is going to explode that like nobody's business. And I can tell you from personal experience, if you're just focused on, I'm going to put together a deal and this is what I have to do in this market and I get it and I'm fine with it, we'll make it work. But you haven't kind of got the credit people on board. If you use separate credit or finance people in your business, they're going to be in your office with their hair on fire in a minute flat, wondering why you're crazy. Metrics. And metrics is, I mean that in two very different ways here. One, obviously, is most of us hopefully know that the United States is the only country in the world that doesn't use the metric system. So if I have an entirely domestic business or I'm used to making and selling almost anything in the United States, it's going to be made in imperial sizes. And not just the size and shape of the thing, but if it's a mechanical thing that has spare parts, screws, screw threads, they're typically going to be imperially sized if this is the only place I do it or make it. And now I'm shipping it to people who do things entirely metric. And that's a huge challenge for my customers. I mean, it's a challenge, first of all, just sometimes in terms of how I price things, particularly if I'm pricing things relative to some kind of volume measure. I say it's a measure mechanically. If I'm shipping equipment into some kind of operation where they have maintenance people and they have spare parts, but all their spare parts are metric, and I just ship them something that takes imperial size nuts and bolts and screws, that's a problem. So then I got to think about, do I ship spare parts kits with it? Or, do I set up my line so I actually make a separate set of product for that market that's metric? And so now I'm back to my tooling change design preference problem. I got my manufacturing people some days making metric, some days making imperial size stuff. Or I can take the big leap and say, you know what, we're now an international business. And most of the world does business in metric sizes. And we're going to make metric our new standard. And even here in the United States, we're going to go metric. And that's a bold step, and it says something about you as an international business. It may also piss off a lot of domestic customers if they're used to doing business entirely in imperial sizes, right? So anyway, the point is it can be a huge stressor. The second way I mean metrics, of course, is the measures we use to measure the success of our business. What are the things we're measuring in our financial statement in terms of, the percent of revenue spent on marketing? The percent of revenue spent on our sales force, the commissions we typically spend on sales reps, whatever it is. The point is that your international market in a lot of those dynamics are going to be different. And a lot of companies start with a standard set of metrics. I mean, this is how we do business. This is how we measure success. This is what we look at. And now I'm going to do something where if I apply those metrics to this business, it's always going to look off. And so the question is, how serious am I about this business? Am I serious enough to understand that building a new business in another country is going to produce different kinds of results, and I still want to manage it effectively. I still want to make sure at the end of the day, I'm making more money, not less money. I'm, increasing my return, not diluting my returns. But I may need to measure specific things happening in the business differently in order to know I'm getting where I'm going. So, be intentional about understanding that this is like launching in a way a whole new business, even within my existing business. And what are the metrics I should use to measure success here that might be different than the typical ones I use? Can we protect our intellectual property? I mean, there's no greater nightmare going international than having a business that depends on intellectual property going to markets where intellectual property is loosely protected, let's say. And needless to say, there are more than a few horror stories of American companies losing their intellectual property in other markets for all sorts of reasons. And again, if you're going to invest time and effort, and there are a lot of things you do around that. You can change somewhat with the way you deliver it in terms of who actually gets to see the whole process. Although even then, people are really good at reverse engineering things from back to front and recreating it. Obviously, there's just the cost piece of it of, trade name, trademarks, patents are only good in the countries they're filed and perfected in. And so every time you go to a new market, you need to know it's perfected under that regime if you want to be able to protect it, if it's protectable. And then I say there are certainly markets, and I don't mean to single out China badly for this, but I know lots of people, including myself, who's had this experience where, stuff gets reverse engineered. I mean, they're very good at looking and going, saying, "Hey, you're able to sell this stuff from the United States and make money doing it. I can make it here." And I got lots of people that figure out how to make it. Travel demands. I mean, now again, I'm used to having people go on business, to have meetings, to put deals together, to sell things, to visit customers, to solve a customer service problem. And it's, one thing to hop on the short flight in the morning to Cleveland and, solve a problem and, be back that night or the next day or 2 days later. It's another thing, to fly to India and do this. It takes a lot longer to get there. It's a lot more expensive to get there. You're totally wiped out when you get there, by the way. It's just an unfamiliar environment to you in terms of food, hotels, language, maybe things. So you're not going to be maybe on your A game for those reasons. There are lots of things about that are in themselves actually more exciting and interesting and engaging, of course. But in terms of expecting people just to go about business as usual, that's a tough expectation when you're asking them to do that. So, how do you handle that? And then, of course, there's, in some markets, there's safety and security concerns. It might be different. I did business in a lot of markets where I was not entirely reassured by my company constantly telling me that they had adequate ransom insurance if I were ever kidnapped. I don't know. That was supposed to make me feel better. It usually made me feel worse. But anyway, so you have to deal with that kind of thing. And then there's simple things just like, if I'm going to have somebody go do this, do they have a free day just to get reacclimated before they do something? Do I allow them to stay in a higher class hotel? Do I allow them to fly business class instead of coach? Because they're going to have to unwind from 14 hours in an airplane and then get to it. Anyway, I mean, all those things are just things that should be thought about. Does this lead to outsourcing? So if you have, in smaller companies, obviously it's much more intimate. But if you're a, even medium-sized company and you have, people on a plant floor, you have some people down in down in accounting, whatever. And the head of the company, the chief operating officer, the vice president, whatever, starts going to China, going to Mexico, going to wherever. You may be going there to put together deals that are going to double, triple your sales, and you're going to hire, 50 new people. But they don't know that. And I will guarantee you that when they see people starting to, you just went to China again, they have one thing on their mind, which is they're going to move this thing to China, and we're all out of a job. And that's a huge disruption. So whichever one you're doing, be prepared for it and manage it. Like if it is a growth strategy, then, maybe let a little of that word out. Find some people to reassure that that's not what's happening. Conversely, if it is going to be an outsourcing strategy, understand that, this is going to be disruptive before you actually do it. And, just have a policy, a plan to manage that. Then a couple other things. I don't know why these popped up at the same time. Obviously export compliance, specialized documentation. You need to make sure people know what's required. You have somebody in-house or a service outside who can do this for you and make sure it gets done right. And market intelligence, pricing, competition. Again, it's a different market. There are different players. Pressures on pricing are going to be different than you're used to here. So you need to know that, get that, and understand it. So the number one thing about all this is you need to know that when you're going to do this, strategically speaking, the big question is management committed. Because I got to tell you, I've been in operations where, going to some new market is sort of the pet project of the, head of marketing. But the head boss, the CEO, is not really fully bought into this. He's sort of gone along with it. It's kind of an interesting thing. Okay, great. But the further you get into it, the more he's like, he starts to see some of these disruptions. And he goes, and I just feels like it's more trouble than it's worth. Let's pull the plug. And then you've created these disruptions and dilution of your human resources and spent money you didn't have to spend, all to do nothing for the simple reason that people weren't bought in to begin with. So the point is, this is a complicated thing that affects a lot of people at all parts of your organization. And you can't just assume that we put Toby in charge of exports to wherever. Yeah, okay, that's great. But is he tied in? Is he and so I'll say this other thing. One of the skill sets of somebody doing this for you needs to be team building. Needs to be interacting with other people. They need to be somebody that knows, has access to, doesn't mind knocking on doors of people elsewhere in the company and just saying, hey, can we have a talk? I'm working on this thing. This is going to be coming down the pike. I want to get your feedback. I want to hopefully get you bought in, hear whether you have some other ideas, because I want to come up with the best solution I can for this. So at the end of the day, to manage this, it's a team sport and all these things. Get the people in your operations, do manufacturing, whatever, involved when you're talking about we're going to have to redesign